You could see him. Okay, now everybody sees his screen. This is Doron from Beit Shemesh. Please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Can I have just a thumbs up if you can hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me clearly. Make sure we're all on the same page. All right. The wonders of modern technology. Incredible. Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you. My name is Doron. I actually have some old friends here on the call, which is nice. Adam Siegel and I were roommates in Israel 30 years ago, and the Lintons are old friends. I see some other actually very nice, friendly faces. So, so it's nice to be with you all. You ever hear that phrase that that dog is man's best friend? Everybody's heard that phrase, right? It's actually not true, I recently discovered. Coffee is man's best friend. It is now 3 a.m. here in the Holy Land. And believe it or not, I'm actually in better shape than many of you might be, because I slept. I went to bed about 9:30, slept 4 or 5 hours, you know, got up, had a nice cup of coffee. I'm raring to go. So nice to be with you. And it's a pleasure that this worked out. Both of you rabbis, thank you for organizing and hosting. And it's not an easy subject. You know, there's a story that I sometimes think of you know, this older gentleman who's laying in bed, and he says to his wife, he says, honey, you know, come and sit beside me on the bed. So, you know, she comes, sits beside him, kind of curious. He says, honey, do you remember when we were in our 20s and I broke my leg and you were there with me? Yes, honey, I was. And do you remember when we were in our 40s and you know, I went bankrupt and you were there with me? Yes, honey, I was. And do you remember, you know, when we were in our 50s and, you know, I had a heart attack and you were there with me? Yes, honey, I was. Well, he says, well, my darling, I have something important to tell you. And a tear rolls down her cheek and she leans in and he says, honey, you're bad luck. So there's some subjects that just seem like they're bad luck. They're taboo. People don't want to talk about them, don't want to deal with them. Let's talk about positive things. I want to get into death and burial and cremation. It's like unpleasant. So I want to thank you all for coming, despite this difficult topic, and thank the two Chabads from you know, for hosting, and for the sponsors and everything, you know, because unfortunately it's a difficult subject. By the way, I was never really into this subject myself. I always found that it was kind of morbid. I didn't talk about this kind of thing. I've been living in Israel for close to 30 years, and I've been traveling around Jewish communities pre-COVID in person, and now on Zoom for about 20 and almost 20 years. And my topics are always very positive. I have a book called Raising Kids to Love Being Jewish, and I speak to parents and grandparents about raising their children, their grandchildren to love being Jewish. I have a book called Why Be Jewish. I'm into the positive Jewish identity. I speak about happiness and relationships. I do all kinds of positive stuff. So how did I get into this subject? Well, I was actually about 10, 11 years ago, I was in Florida on a speaking tour, and I opened up a Jewish newspaper, and I notice a advertisement from a Jewish funeral home in a Jewish newspaper offering Jewish cremations. And I was in shock because I'm a traditional Jewish boy from Montreal. I didn't know there was such a thing as a Jewish cremation. And I started getting into it, and I spent 3 years researching the subject in depth, read everything you could possibly read on the subject, talked to all the experts, got the blueprints of the ovens. I mean, I did everything. And the result is the book, Rabbi, that you mentioned before, Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View, Mosaic Press. I'll give you details later. And these talks. And I've been traveling around speaking about this, and now on Zoom. And although it's an uncomfortable topic, and it was one for me, but it becomes an important one. And that's where I want to get us going. Why is it important? And the answer, there's a lot of answers. But the answer today, I think, for many of us, is because it is so common. Rabbi, you mentioned, Brooke, I think you mentioned at the beginning, you know, the majority of people in your community, there's places where it's higher, there's places where it's lower. overall nationally for all Americans, right? Not just Jews, but for Christian Americans, for the 340 million Americans. In 2017, it became a majority of the dead were cremated, meaning it used to be a majority were buried. Now it's already 52, 53% of the American dead are buried, are cremated. It's a majority right now. There's about a 1% death rate in the Western world, meaning that you have about 3 million American dead every year. Unfortunately, 2020 was a little bit higher, as we know, than normal. So out of those 3 million deaths, roughly 52%, 53% are cremated. Now the Jews we're not that high, but we're not that much lower. No one knows the exact number, but I'll give you one statistic. I'm not going to belabor statistics tonight. I'll give you resources online in my book to find things later if you want more info. But Rabbi Elchanan Zon is sort of the rabbi's rabbi on these issues. He's the head of the Chevra Kaddish, the Burial Society in Queens, and the national one. And he did some research and he found, get this is approximately 10 years ago that he did this, that in Jewish funeral homes in the New York area, 25% of the requests were for cremation. Now, did you notice those three sort of caveats along the way? That's about 10 years ago, it's higher now. That's in New York, most culturally Jewish part of the country, and that's the people who choose a Jewish funeral home. Not to mention all the people who aren't connected enough that they would go out of their way to choose a Jewish funeral home. So there's no doubt that something like 35 to 40% of the Jewish dead in America are being cremated right now. That is a sea change. Only a generation or two ago, it was less than 5%. It is now very quickly getting to the halfway mark. And my question for you, and this is why I love Zoom, because if you understand and use, I don't know if you're on Zoom 10 hours a day like me, or if it's your first time, but somewhere on your screen, for me, it's in the bottom in the middle, there's a chat function. You can chat to one person or you can chat to everyone. So I want you to tell me, why is cremation so common today? Unlike when most of us were kids, it wasn't the norm. Now it's becoming the norm. For Jews, for non-Jews, tell me what you think. Use the chat function. Type in, this can be reasons that you're thinking of for yourself, that your relatives have cited, that you've seen in the media. It doesn't have to be Jewish at all, for non-Jews as well. Just why in the Western world today, in the US today, is cremation so common, much more common than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago? So I see we're already getting some answers. That's great. Cheaper. Okay, we get it. Definitely. Eastern influences. Aviva, thank you. Cheaper, absolutely. Keep going. Keep going. What else? You've gotten a couple of the main ones. This is great. Okay, there's more. There's more. Anyone else? So it's interesting because what we're going to try and do, scattering the ashes, people like that idea. Absolutely. Tattoos, interesting. So Adam, you're saying it can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That's the idea. So might as well cremate. Further from death, it's scarier, meaning sort of denial. Is that what you mean, Scott? Yeah, kind of denial, disconnect from
that people don't die at home anymore, and the idea of death is more frightening to people than the idea of being in the ground. This is how my relative explained
Very good.
it.
Excellent. Claustrophobia of burial. Excellent. Rabbi Edelman said, very good. Okay, guys, you're impressive. Not bad. Not bad. I think you got all the main reasons. You better use some space. Thank you, Leslie. Very good. So this is what I want to address. What I want to do, and what we're going to do together in the next, 45 minutes or so, something like that. We'll see how it goes. Is I want to analyze the structure of what we're going to do. Is I want to analyze these reasons, to think through why people are choosing cremation, which of these reasons make sense and which don't make sense. By the way, I'm very transparent and very direct. You will find that at the end, that there are some reasons that are true, that the cremation proponents, they have a point, and there's many reasons that aren't. But we're gonna focus on what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And then we're gonna flip the script, and then we're gonna say, okay, so why has Judaism and why have Jews throughout the millennium always focused on Jewish burial? And then we'll get into a time for questions and comments. So that's basically the structure. I want to analyze these reasons that I think you've listed most of them or all of them. We're going to analyze the reasons that people are focusing on for cremation. We're then going to talk about burial. why Jews focus on burial, and then we're going to get into questions and comments. Okay, so the first things you mentioned were cost. Let's leave that for now. Environmental issues. A couple people mentioned things along those lines. Environmental issues. So this is often cited. There's two mentions of environmental issues. One is the amount of space, the use of land, and what goes into the land. They're related, but they're different, if you notice, right? The first point is the phrase they like to use is that land is for the living. I don't know if anybody's heard that phrase. Land is for the living. The point being that we have a limited amount of land. We have a growing population. So why waste land on dead bodies that don't need it? Isn't it morally better to leave it for the birds and the trees? This, by the way, is a very powerful moral argument. And theoretically, it could be true, by the way. I mean, like if you had to choose between, land to breathe and land for the dead, like you hear the point, right? The only problem is that I did the math. I'm not the first person to do the math, but I did the math. And get this, if every American who died, 3 million a year, and I'm not speaking to every American, I'm speaking to the Jewish community, less than 2%, right? But if every American who died were to be buried, it would take 10,000 years to use up 1% of the American landmass. Do you get that stat?
Wow.
That's how much land there is in the US. Now, if you want to be buried in downtown Milwaukee or downtown Chicago, I get the point. There's no room. But within 30 to 60 minutes of every metropolitan area, there is a ton of room. If you doubt me, next time you fly, Adam, you'll know this, our pilot, next time you fly, look down. There's a ton of land in the country. There's no real issue with land. By the way, this is true in North America, in South America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia. This is true everywhere around the world. There's only 3 places on planet Earth, to my knowledge, that it's not true. And that is parts of Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And by the way, there are solutions in each of those places. Okay, so when you look through this, by the way, you'll note that serious environmentalists don't actually talk about the amount of land that is used, because burial uses so little land and there is so much land. How often do you actually have to go to a cemetery anyway? It has to be downtown. You can't drive for 30 minutes or an hour to go to a cemetery. There's plenty of land. Okay, the more serious environmental concern about burial is not the amount of land. That's not really an issue. It's what goes into the land. 2 main critiques of American burials, of how we are polluting planet Earth. Number 1, metal caskets. A tremendous amount of metal. We're talking Golden Gate Bridge after Golden Gate Bridge after Golden Gate Bridge. You have to make the metal, you put it into the ground, it rusts for hundreds or 1,000 years, whatever. And embalming. For those who don't know, embalming is when they remove the blood and the other liquids from the body, replace it with preservatives. By the way, formaldehyde is still the classic preservative, although they're trying to replace it. Basically, it's for viewing, to let the body decompose slower. Of course, it still decomposes, but it's slower. And it's a tremendous amount of toxic chemicals that are being put into planet Earth. Now, obviously, these 2 things are legitimately really bad for the environment, right? But now, think for yourselves. Notice anything these 2 factors, metal caskets and embalming, have in common? What is the commonality of these 2 things, ladies and gents? I see some of you are smiling. Rabbis, don't answer the question. I know you know the answer. They're not Jewish. Thank you, Trudy. They are not Jewish. They are both against the Jewish tradition. They're both against Jewish law. We don't do either. The embalming is considered a desecration of the body. If you want to understand why, if you have a morbid streak, go on YouTube, look at an embalming, and you'll understand in about 30 seconds why we don't embalm. Okay, it's kind of gross and disrespectful. We don't do metal caskets. We encourage simple wood caskets. Here in Israel, by the way, you carry the body in a casket, but when it's actually put into the ground, there's no casket. It's just in the burial shrouds. Right? There's no casket. But we do. But even in most places where you have a wood casket, you put 3 holes in the bottom so it touches the earth. Right? There's no metal. We discourage metal caskets. So Jewish burial has always been known as environmentally friendly. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. Cremation uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. We are all trying to get rid of our cars and replace them with hybrids or with electric cars, trying to cut down our use of fossil fuels. And suddenly, you're using a tremendous amount of electricity, right, to burn bodies. Furthermore, crematorium release a tremendous amount of toxic chemicals into the air. If you're of my age or older and you have any fillings in your teeth, over here, you probably have mercury in your teeth. Now, it's a problem that's going away because they don't put mercury into the fillings of little kids when they get cavities. But for our generation and older, they did. Very, very bad for the environment. There's actually many municipalities that don't allow crematoriums to be built right beside schools. Ask yourself why. Because you can Google it. Because they're very polluting. So the idea is like this. I'm an environmentalist. I'm very into the environment. I teach my kids that approach, and I think it's important. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. Cremation uses fossil fuels, releases chemicals into the air. They're in favor of what's called green burial. The main 2 components of green burial, no metal caskets, no embalming. We click the numbers. Now, there's other things, how you arrange a cemetery and maintenance and things like that, and some are better, some are worse, but green burial is the answer, and Jewish burial has always been a model of that. Okay, let's go through, we're going through your list of why people were choosing cremation today, Jews and non-Jews, why people are choosing cremation today, analyzing what makes the most sense. Adam, you mentioned tattoos. There's the story that if a person has a tattoo, they can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. For your information, Judaism certainly discourages tattoos. The body is as it should be, but as my grandmother, would say, the tattoo cemetery connection is a baba maisa. There is no such Jewish law. Baba maisa meaning like a grandmother story. Grandmothers make up stories. They didn't want their kids to do things that were wrong. So there is no problem burying Jews with tattoos in a Jewish cemetery. The claustrophobia idea is fascinating. I'll tell you why, because people are afraid of being buried. By the way, in certain old cemeteries, they have a little bell because a couple hundred years ago, they sometimes buried people who were still alive and they were afraid of waking up. And so they put a little a rope and a bell to let people know, right? So there's this fear of by the way, as far as I know, in the Western world, it has been more than 150 years since there's been a case of burying a live person. I don't think it's a real concern. And just think of it this way. Either you believe that there is consciousness after death or there isn't, right? I mean, it's an either or binary choice, right? So if the soul knows what's happening, you think that being burned in a fire is better, is going to be more enjoyable? I mean, either you don't know or you do know. It's kind of an interesting thing. I think that the more common version of this question, and we can discuss it more later if you want to, is discomfort with decomposition. It's kind of gross, right? People don't want to be eaten by the worms. You see how it's a connected idea? And I hear this a lot. So listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that burial is pleasant, okay? I remember high school labs, okay? I remember decomposition is disgusting, let's be honest, okay? All I want to do is to bring into focus that cremation ain't much better. I told you a little bit at the beginning how I got into this subject. I was always into the positive stuff, and then I was in Florida, I see this ad and I start researching. And I want to share with you what the #1 surprise was I found in my research. The #1 surprise was I always thought that cremation was something like a microwave oven, meaning you put the body in, you press the button, 5 minutes later, 30 seconds later, whatever, ashes come out in an urn and you do a ceremony. Oh no. Typical thin person The cremation takes 60 to 90 minutes. If you are like me and 2020 did a number on you, they call it the quarantine 19 or whatever they call it, the extra pounds putting on, So if you're overweight, right, it takes 2 to 3 hours. For the 25% of Americans who have a BMI of 30 or more, like technically obese, more than 25 pounds overweight, whatever it is, it's a quarter of us. Unfortunately, I'm heading in that direction this year. 3 to 4 hours, meaning cremation is not quick. Furthermore, forgive me, it's not particularly pleasant either. Now, we put up a wall so we don't see it, but it's loud, it's smelly, the body is not calm, the bones are moving, the muscles are extending and contracting, the brain is sizzling. It is a disgusting, violent act. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that burial is pleasant. It's gross as well, but they're both kind of gross. And get this, burial is the natural way of every living thing. A plant grows, blossoms, goes back to planet Earth. An animal is born, runs around the forest, goes back to planet Earth. Burial is natural. Cremation is an artificial, mechanical grasp at control. So they're both kind of gross. One is natural, though. One isn't. We're going quickly through the reasons that you cited why people are choosing cremation today. Disconnect from the Holocaust, absolutely. It used to be that, people would say, the Nazis did it, how can we do it? Today, that's really not an issue. So if that was a person's reason not to cremate, if that was their only reason, then that's largely gone. The government directives, I don't know what you're referring to exactly, Gloria, but in most places you can do whatever you want with disposal of the dead. Maybe you'll tell me later. The other people don't visit cemeteries. Very interesting. Robin said that. So quiz for you. Okay. The Lintons are on this call, old friends that I guided. I'm a tour guide here in Israel. Before COVID, I was a tour guide here in Israel. God willing, it'll come back in the summer. We'll see what happens. So this is a true or false. Just use a thumbs up if what I'm saying is true, a thumbs down if what I'm saying is false. Okay, this is for everybody on the screen. The favorite place that I have to bring tourists as a tour guide, when families come, my favorite site that I bring tourists to in Israel is the grave of Moses, the grave of Moshe Rabbeinu. True, it's my favorite place. What do you guys think? False, it's not. I'm saying false. Lintons are saying false. Deb is saying false. Everybody's saying false. Saskia is saying true. Trudy's saying double true. Wow, Trudy, okay, good. No, double false? Good. So you got it. It's false. Sorry, everybody. Now, there's 2 ways that you could have known that it's false. Well, Linton's 3 ways because he would have known that, like, I didn't bring you there. But there's 2 ways that you could have known. Excellent. Trudy got it right away. That first of all, he's not buried in Israel. Remember, he stayed on what's now the east bank of the Jordan River in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan today. He never made it in. We can hop a plane in normal times to come to Israel, but he never made it here. And second of all, what Trudy said is right on. We don't know where he's buried. The commentators explain that God knew that Moses was so great that his place would have become sort of a place of idol worship. And better that nobody visits his grave. Nobody knows where his grave is. So has anyone ever visited the grave of Moses? Never in 3,300 years. And yet, archaeologically, we know that at that time, 3,300 years ago, there was certainly cremation. It was the norm, actually, in the ancient world. Yet God did not choose cremation. He chose burial. Because get this, in our modern minds, we put 2 things together, right? We put having a grave and visiting a grave, right, as the same thing. Why do you have a grave? So people will visit the grave. And if people aren't going to visit the grave, either because they're in a different city, modern mobility, or the kids aren't traditional, or whatever, why bother having one? And just like bring the urn with you, just scatter the ashes, just send them into space, right? And so the answer to that is that those 2 things actually are not connected. If you like visiting graves, and I actually connect to visiting graves. Don't worry, I don't go every day. I'm normal, but it does mean something to me. I was just actually in Montreal visiting my parents, and while I'm there, I try. Montreal winters are not easy, but I try and go to the cemetery to visit my grandparents' graves, and I connect to it in some way. You don't have to. There's no obligation to visit graves, but if you do, that's great. But if you don't, okay, that's fine also. But it has nothing to do with whether or not the body deserves a grave. You get the different approach? Right? Whether somebody visits or not. By the way, we're often surprised how much a kid or a grandkid gets into genealogy or history or connection or becomes a little more traditional, and it means something to them. We're often surprised by it. But even without that, we will learn that Judaism is big in favor of graves, even when there isn't visitation. So I think we've gone through most of the reasons that you've said. I'm seeing if I missed any along the way. Yeah, just the rise of Eastern influences, Aviva said. Very true. You know, there's certain fads, certain things come into style and go out of style. I don't know what the situation is with you, rabbis, but like here in Israel, we really haven't had functioning synagogues in the same way that we used to have. And sometimes they're more open, less open, 10 people inside, 20 people inside. Right now, it's very strict. So in my building, we have a little, Kabbalat Shabbat welcoming Shabbos ceremony up in the parking lot. And so that's the only time, I'm glad I'm not the only one. That's the only time that I actually wear a tie anymore. I used to wear a tie regularly, and so on Friday nights I wear a tie generally. And my kids, my teenagers. By the way, guys, I have 5 teenagers. Come on, people, give me some love. 5 teenagers. Anyways, so my teenagers are always complaining about my ties. My ties are too wide, my ties are too thin, my ties are too wide, my ties are too thin. And I don't want to get rid of my ties. Why? Because they're very nice ties. And you and I both know that in 5 years, they're going to be back in, right? Styles come, styles go, like Eastern influences come, they go. Like, that's not the reason to choose something like how you're going to be remembered, how you're going to be buried, what's going to happen. So as we go through the reasons why people today are choosing cremation, as you notice, one by one, they're actually all based on misinformation. It's not true. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. There is no land problem. Cremation is one that causes pollution, not burial. The fad, the mobility, all these reasons fall away except one. There is one reason that people choose or cite for cremation that is undeniable. What is that reason? Money. At the end of the day, in 90% of the cases, by the way, it's not 100% of the cases, you can do funerals cheaper, and some people do cremations expensive. There's no guarantee, especially, by the way, in COVID times, where in many places you're not allowed to do funeral services, and it's graveside, and you're skipping that whole step. And if people are low income or whatever, there's certainly ways, talk to the rabbis, of if money is an issue, there's certainly ways of radically reducing the costs of burial. But for most people, let's be honest, for most people, burial is much more expensive than cremation. By the way, it's like a $5,000 or $6,000 difference. Just think about it. A typical burial is going to end up, you tell me what it is in Wisconsin, but a typical burial is going to end up costing you something like $8,000 to $10,000. And a typical cremation is going to end up costing you something like $2,000 to $3,000. Now, again, there's exceptions to that, but that's the norm. When it gets down to it, that's really the only reason that actually makes sense. So now we have to deal with the flip side. Why is it worth the extra money? We just analyzed the reasons that people often cite for cremation, went through them. They actually don't make sense except the money issue. That's true for most people. So why is it worth the extra money? And that's what I want to focus on right now. Gentlemen, when you were proposing to your beloved and you gave her a ring, I assume, that you did not get the ring out of the bottom of a Cracker Jack box, right? You actually put some money into the ring, right? So some things are worth the extra money. And we're going to see that throughout history, Jews have made it clear that this is one of those things, that burial is worth the extra effort and the extra money. By the way, if you are pre-planning, prepaying, which is what I suggest, there's so much, because of what I do now on this subject. My number one request for speaking to communities, 10 years ago, was always raising kids and grandkids to love being Jewish, why be Jewish, happiness, that kind of stuff. Now cremation is my number one request. This is so common. I'm speaking about it once a week, twice a week now on Zoom. This week's actually 3 times. I'll be up in the middle of the night 3 times this week. Two out of 3 are actually on cremation. One's on raising kids, 2 or 3 on cremation. It's so common, and I deal with so many cases, and it's so hard on families. This issue causes such disruption to families. An event that should be a difficult, but a beautiful end of the life cycle, a coming together of a family. There's fighting, and there's grief, and there's greed, and there's money. I'm a big fan of pre-planning. You put, in your wallet, you have it written down very, very clearly, that when my time comes, hopefully not for a very long time, first person to call is the Chabad rabbi. Here's his phone number, his Instagram, his WhatsApp, his email, his home phone, right? Everything goes according to him, right? You have it pre-planned and prepaid for, so there's no fighting over the money. You know what it is? When you plan 10 years in advance or whatever it's going to be, it's an extra coffee every once in a while. That's the difference. Okay, if you go to Starbucks once or twice a week, that's added up. That's the difference on the long term. Okay, so the money issue is there. It's real, but it's not. In the long term, it doesn't make that huge a difference if you plan early. So let's now talk about why. Why have Jews for thousands of years focused on burial? The Roman historian Tacitus, when he described us to his compatriots, right, 2,000 years ago, one of the few outstanding character traits that he said was that the Jews bury rather than burn the dead. It always stood out. The question is why? Well, few reasons that I want to share with you, then we're going to open it up to questions and comments. Reason number 1, in the ghetto, I think it's the Lvov ghetto in World War II, there was a rabbi, Kovno actually ghetto, he was in the Kovno ghetto. There was a rabbi named Ephraim Oshri. He actually survived the war, and he told the following story. One day he's in the ghetto, and a Nazi officer, blonde hair, blue eyes, bursts in, and Rabbi Oshri thinks that it's his last moments on the planet, and the Nazi officer slams the door behind him and starts speaking to the rabbi in perfect Yiddish. Rabbi, I'm a Jew. I look the part. This is how I have stayed alive for the last 2 years. But I'm a very sick man. I'm about to die, and I know what they're going to do to me. They are going to bury me in a Nazi cemetery with a Nazi cross over my body, surrounded by other Nazis. Rabbi, I did this to survive temporarily, but I can't be in that place with a Nazi cross and Nazis around me forever. Can I be cremated to avoid that fate? And Rabbi Oshri gently said, my dear, dear child, no, you can't. A Jew must do whatever they can to have proper Jewish burial. And in the event when they can't have proper Jewish burial, unfortunately, these crazy times of World War II, at least to be buried, we can never choose cremation. And he cited verse after verse, Talmudic reference after Talmudic reference, Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law. This is actually a mitzvah. People don't realize it's not just a custom. Deuteronomy 21:22, if you want to look into it, is one of the text sources. It's about the death penalty in Judaism is basically a deterrence, right? It's the Talmud says that if it's practiced once in 70 years, it's too much. Right? That's how rare it is. Even in the case when it actually happens, when you string a guy up, the Torah says, the Bible says, bring him down, right, and bury him, because every human being should be buried. It is that fundamental to Jewish law. When a new Jewish community is formed, what are the things that it does first? School, Jewish school for kids, continuity, a mikveh, ritual bath, and Chevra Kadisha, the burial society. It's that important. if I was writing a Bible, so to speak, I don't know if I would really care what happens to dead bodies. You know, what did Jews say when we have a drink? L'chaim, to life, right? We focus on life. But you know what? The Bible is actually incredibly focused on this. Abraham buys a plot for Sarah, buries her in Hebron. Moses at the end we mentioned. And all throughout, Abraham is buried and Rachel is buried and Yaakov is buried and Joseph is buried. I mean, it's actually a fundamental theme of Judaism, surprisingly important. The first reason that Jews focus on burial is that this is a core part of our religion. By the way, this has filtered down into Jewish consciousness. Here in Israel, you may have heard, I'm sure you recognize the name Gilad Shalit. Everybody recognize that name? Gilad Shalit, right? He's the poor boy that was, he was actually recently married, I think. He was in a Hamas jail as an Israeli soldier captured on the border, the Gaza border, and he was in a Hamas jail for 5 years. And there was a major trade, I don't know if there's a better word for it, prisoner exchange, if you want to call it that, where we freed 2,000 terrorists. By the way, terrorists, people like, even with people with blood on their hands, we freed 2,000 terrorists to get them out. Very controversial decision here in Israel. Over 10% of them have been rearrested for terrorist crimes, by the way, since. And there's a whole discussion, how do you make this decision? Should take it away from the politicians, whatever. Most people have heard that. We're all very glad that he's out and he's okay, but it's, you know, it's not a simple question, I think we all realize. Most people have heard of him. What many people have not heard of is that in Israel's history, on several occasions since 1948, we have traded hundreds of live terrorists to get back dead bodies. Now, you may be for or against that decision. Not a simple one, but the fact is we do it because providing Jewish burial for all Jews, that's so ingrained in Jewish consciousness. That's the first reason why we have focused on burial, why burial is so important, because it's a core part of who we are. It's a core part of Judaism. It's not a minor part. Number two, like this. If you were to make two maps of the world, one map was a map of monotheistic belief, where people believe in one God, versus no gods, atheism, right? Or many gods, polytheism. And you make another map of burial and cremation. You would find that the two maps overlap incredibly closely. In other words, where people believe in one God, they generally choose burial. Just think about it, okay? Christian Europe, while it was Christian Europe, there was no cremation. The Catholic Church outlawed cremation for 1,500 years. It's only the last 40 years that there's been a major, major change. And now cremation has become the norm. Post-Christian Europe, cremation has become the norm. In the Far East, polytheism. Japan, 97% cremation. India, polytheism, 90% cremation, right? It goes, even in the States, right? Bible Belt has far lower cremation rates than the secular coasts, right? It's fascinating that there's this overlap. By the way, the Middle East, Islam has no cremation. There's not one crematorium in an Islamic country. It doesn't exist. Here in Israel, by the way, there's one. It basically services Russian non-Jews, but unfortunately it's starting to spread even here. Again, the percentage is very low, but it is starting. But it's almost a non, in common daily life, it almost doesn't exist. So there's this natural connection between belief in one God and burial. There's a lot of literature as to why that is. I personally believe the explanation is very simple. The beginning of the Bible, the proof text of monotheism, says simply that every human being is created in the image of God, right? You don't mess with that image. Now, it's not a physical thing. God is not a body, God forbid, right? But our body has some divine structure to it. And you don't mess with that. You don't burn it. You lay it gently to sleep. The idea of death, and some of you talked about this in the chats, originally, people are uncomfortable with it. Modern society generally does two things that seem opposite, but they're very similar with death. One is we speed it up, and one is we slow it down. What are the examples? Well, slowing it down is embalming. I'm going to fight decomposition. Instead of taking a few months or a year, it's going to take 2 or 3 years, whatever. I'm going to metal caskets, slow down decomposition. Mausoleums, put it above ground so you don't decompose so quickly, right? This is all, right? Or cryogenics, if you want to go really far out on this. This is all part of the denial of death, fighting death. On the other end of the spectrum, there is a different but surprisingly similar attitude, which is let's get it over with. Let's press a button and cremate. Let's not do a 7-day Shiva. Let's go down to 3 days, 1 day, afternoon, memorial service instead of a funeral service, whatever it's going to be. Let's speed it up. I want to go back to work tomorrow, right? Two opposites slow down the process, speed up the process. But at their core, there's a remarkable similarity, a non-acceptance of the process. And what Judaism says is, don't speed it up. Don't slow it down. Don't show your power. For 6 days a week, we work, we build the world. On the 7th day, you sit back and you know what? I'm not in charge. Our whole lives, we build and we improve. And at the end of our lives, we say, you know what? I'm not in charge. I'm not going to try and speed it up. I'm not going to try and slow it down. I'm going to let it be. You ever been to a Jewish cemetery, do a Jewish funeral, and there's a thing, God forbid, that the mourners, the close relatives, they tear kriya. Have you seen this? It's like they tear the outer garment, right? By the way, I've seen in many places now, what people are doing is they give them, the funeral home gives them a little ribbon, and they cut the ribbon. Have you noticed that? Just as a side point, not our main subject here, but it's a sweet idea. That's not the point. It's a sweet idea. The point is, it's your garment. It's torn. It's not something that's given to you and that disappears. The point is, it's supposed to be you're torn, right? Yeah, there's a wound. It's painful, right? So imagine the following: when a person dies, Mother Earth herself, the planet, tears kriya. The earth is opened up. There is a grave. It is not normal. It is not okay. We do not just go back to work. We do not ignore it. We cry out. There is pain. And then slowly, calmly, lovingly, friends, community, put the earth back. The body is covered. Healing begins. But there is always a gravestone, a scar. The person is never forgotten. The world needs burial. Healthy societies need burial. Denying death like the modern world does is unhealthy. You ever, do you guys remember John Glenn, the astronaut, right? So he was from the Midwest. Wasn't he from the Midwest somewhere? I forget where he was. Well, Ohio, actually, not Ohio. So John Glenn was a famous astronaut. Thank you, Simon. Ohio. He was a famous astronaut, became a US senator. And then he did something that many of us have this fantasy of doing. He went back into space. I think he was the oldest person ever to be in space. He was like 70 years old or something. I don't know if anybody knows. And he was on the cover of Time magazine and all this stuff. It was like incredible. Everybody was so proud of John Glenn. I want to tell you, I was impressed by John Glenn, and I was embarrassed for us. Why? Why was he being celebrated? Because of his wisdom, his experience. He was being celebrated because he was able to act like a young guy. Isn't that kind of backwards? The Western world doesn't respect older people, doesn't respect experience and wisdom. And it's all part of this, certainly, all the more so like the dead, like get rid of them. And what Judaism is saying is that no, as people get older, more respect is due to them. And when a person dies, ultimate respect is due for their body. And we don't just get rid of it or speed it up or slow it down. We lay it gently to earth lovingly. A few other ideas, and then we're going to get to questions and comments. What do you do, ladies and gentlemen? You have your chat function. What do you do if, God forbid, there is a Torah scroll that is damaged beyond repair? Right? If you can fix it, you fix it. That's what scribes are for, right? But if there's a Torah scroll that is damaged beyond repair, I see, Alex, you already answered, you bury it. Everybody's heard this. Remember Hurricane Katrina? There were a bunch of shuls that were destroyed and they buried the Torah scrolls, right? So get this. You and I, right? We are holier than a Torah scroll. By the way, I can prove this to you. God forbid, rabbis, it's only a hypothetical God forbid scenario. God forbid there is a fire at the Chabad. Do you try and save the Torah scrolls? Well, of course you try, if it's safe. If the fireman says, yeah, no problem, we got this under control, there's just a little smoke, but you can go in and get your ritual object, sir, ma'am, do it. You know, it's a huge thing. It's the holiest object we have. But if there is any risk to you, you're not allowed to try and save the Torah scroll. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, if you're old or you're young, if you're more observant or less observant, if you're healthy or you're sick, it doesn't matter, because each of us is holier than a Torah scroll. A Torah scroll that is damaged beyond repair, we bury it. A person is holier than a Torah scroll. All of us, we bury that person. So one last idea, and then we'll get to questions and comments. Raise your hand if you have ever visited a Jewish monastery or a Jewish convent. Anybody? It was the trick question, everybody. How did I know? Because there are no Jewish convents or Jewish monasteries. Ever wonder why? It's an interesting question, isn't it? So Adam saying you never wondered? So it's interesting. You think Catholics are stupid and you think Eastern religions are stupid? There's a billion people out there. No, they're not. They're very intelligent people. It's a different philosophy, right? And obviously there's different, Catholicism and Eastern religions are very different, but on this point, they're actually the same. If you were to ask a Catholic, who's the holiest person on the planet, who would they say most likely? The Pope, right? The Pope doesn't get married, doesn't engage in intimacy, right? Celibate. Eastern religions, if you're aware, they're abstinent, they're celibate, right? The gurus sit on a mountaintop, right? Hard floor, no good food, right? Why is that? Because they have a philosophy. Their philosophy is, if you want to be spiritual, you want to go up, you have to deny the physical. No physical comforts, no physical intimacy, right? It's either physical or spiritual. So, no surprise that the body, you know, for some people, what about us? We say that if you want to be spiritual, you don't fight the physical, ignore the physical, you lift up the physical. On Shabbat, we have good food. It's a mitzvah to have a beautiful, intimate life with your spouse, right? Physicality is good. God is a good God that created a good world. We lift it up. So the body is a partner with the soul. They work together. Imagine the following scenario. God forbid, husband dies, and the widow, they've been married for 50 years, right? The 75-year-old widow gets up from Shiva, puts on her red party dress, and goes clubbing that night trying to find a new guy. Would that seem normal to you? Of course not, right? When you have a partner, you don't just leave it and move on. In Judaism, the body and the soul are partners. The soul is very aware of what is happening to its body during life and after life. And we can talk about it more in the questions and comments period if you want. The point is like this. The body and the soul are partners, and we treat the body with respect. I couldn't give charity without my body. I couldn't have children without my body. It's a partnership with the soul, and we lay it gently down to rest. So let's summarize, and then we'll get to questions and comments. We started out with the reality that in our generation today, things have changed, and a huge number of people, majority of Americans, and an increasing number of Jews are choosing cremation. We asked why. Environmental reasons, mobility issues, all these kind of things. And we go down through it, and we can talk about more if you want. The reasons are all not true, except for one. At the end of the day, it is cheaper, in most cases, not all, in most cases, to cremate. So then we ask the question, why should we spend the extra money? Why should we bury? And there's a lot of reasons, and I'll give you some resources online in my book, but I just shared a few of them in the short time that we have together. Some of those reasons were This is a big focus of Judaism. This is a mitzvah. The Rabbi Oshri in the Of No Ghetto story. We talked about the fact that healthy societies need burial, right? It's unhealthy to try and speed it up or slow it down or fight it or ignore it. Accept it. We talked about the fact that monotheists choose burial generally. There's this intuitive connection that we have. We talked about the idea that God chose burial, right, for Moses. And so we follow him and we choose burial. We talked about the fact that that the body and the soul are partners. We talked about the Kriya, the tear and Kriya, that the earth tears Kriya, so to speak. Tear is a tear, it's a double phrase. That we accept it. It's a beautiful part of our catharsis, of our moving on. And that we talked about the fact that the soul knows what's going on. One last idea, and very quickly, I have this monologue in my head. I don't know where I got it from, of this older Jewish guy, and he calls his kids and he says, "Listen, I may not have been the best Jew on planet Earth. Some things I did, some things I didn't do. I didn't have much of an education. Maybe looking back, I would do things differently. I don't know. But there's one thing I know. I was born a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. And when I die, I want to be buried as Jews have been buried for thousands of years. I want the rabbi to say the Hebrew prayers. I want a little bit of earth from the land of Israel. I want the Hebrew date on that gravestone, right? I want everything, because on my last statement to planet Earth, on my last decision, so to speak, I want it to say, I may not have been a perfect Jew, but I'm a proud Jew. So to me, that's very touching. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for listening and participating. I want to open it up to questions, comments, anything you want to share. Rabbis, how do you want to handle this? Just like people can turn off their mutes or do it by chat, or I don't know how you want to, whatever's good for you.
Whoever wants to unmute or raise your hand.
Might
Doron?
be a little easier if people can type their question
Yes.
in the chat box, and then I'll be happy to read out some questions, and I'll select some questions and you can answer them.
Great.
So if you have a question, please type away.
Doron, maybe you
Yeah.
can answer for some people. I have a question that I get often. What
Please.
would you say to somebody who is struggling with the fact that their parents told them they want to be cremated, and they really know it's wrong, and on the other hand, they really want to do the wishes of their parents?
It's a great question, and it happens, I get this question a lot. The first thing is that if you have particular cases that come up, talk to the rabbi, talk to Rabbi Brook, talk to Rabbi Edelman. They have experience in this. I can give some direction as well. I have a colleague in Scottsdale that she talks to families. She's very effective that's on it. But I'll give you the principle of the question, okay? Every case is different. I'll give you the principle. And I'll ask it like this. When do you think I am closer to God? Now, when I'm alive, or so to speak, when I'm upstairs? Well, it's kind of interesting that like God puts us here on the planet for a reason, right? This is our chance to build and to change and to improve. But for eternity, we're upstairs, so to speak, right? That's when I'm closest. When is my knowledge of God closest or best? Well, upstairs, right? Right now, I'm living in a world of distractions. There's news and challenges and COVID and the Capitol riot and there's war and peace and making a living. Like I'm so distracted. When I'm upstairs, so to speak, after 120, I have much greater clarity. So the answer is like this: the person who requested to be cremated, in almost all cases, did so for reasons that right now they already know are not valid reasons. Right now, they have much greater clarity. They see things from a different perspective. And right now, right, they want to be buried. Just think about it. Why did they choose cremation? Because they thought it was better for the environment. We just showed it wasn't. because they didn't want to be a burden, right? Well, no, I mean, I want that burden. If I can't properly bury my parents, God forbid, I mean, that's what I'm here for. Isn't that sort of the greatest final respect I can do for those who raised me? I mean, right? So because of the extra money, listen, in scheme of things, when you add up that extra $5,000 or $6,000 spread over a lifetime, I mean, it's a vacation. People have cars. I mean, it's again, one shot, you leave it till the end, it's a big hit. I understand that. I mean, everybody's struggling in the modern economy, but in the long term, so the truth is, and I think this is the core of the answer, that if this person really understood the issue and really understood how much it means to me, they would have chosen burial. And that's the principle that I come back to on these issues. I'm seeing some more in the chat box. I can just go straight there, maybe. So the burial vault is not required for someone who asked. Again, certain municipalities, certain funeral cemeteries have their own rules, but in terms of Jewish law, most certainly not. Aviva, you're asking, does Torah offer any guidance for burial versus cremation for non-Jews? There is no doubt that it is better for non-Jews to be buried. Non-Jews are created in the image of God, the Tselem Elokim. We encourage them to be buried. That being said, it is not an obligation for them in the same way that it is an obligation for us. Right? It is not one of the 7 commandments of Noah, right? The Noahide laws, the main rules, which are actually categories, they're pretty big, but it's not an obligation for them in law, but it is encouraged for them. I encourage non-Jews to bury all the time, and it's better for them. And I've talked to great rabbis about this, and that is the consensus. It's not, by the way, universal. Some say, it depends on what they want to do, and we don't get involved. It's not one of the 7 mitzvahs, but the consensus of the of authorities that I know do say that we should encourage non-Jews to be buried. It is better for them. Yeah. So Rhonda, you're pointing out that if a Jew picks burial, doesn't mean that it's done halachically. You're 100% right. My attitude to this is, even if one doesn't understand, Jewish law fully. And by the way, let's be honest, who really does understand Jewish law fully, except for you rabbis? I'm sure you do. But I mean, it's a path, right? You know how do you say Jewish law in Hebrew? Anybody know? Halacha. I see Adam is mouthing it. Halacha, right? The only thing is that halacha does not actually translate as Jewish law. What's the root, the shoresh of halacha? Holech. I go, I walk, a path. The word halacha, Jewish law, actually doesn't mean Jewish law. It means a path. Just like Lahavdil, the Buddhists have a path. So we have a path. It's called our tradition. It's called Jewish law. And the point is to be going on that path in our own way. You don't change your life tomorrow, do everything tomorrow. It's a path leading us to somewhere. So we try and go on that path, and to the best of our ability. And in some things, you just kind of like trust the path. Like this is like the final decision. The rabbis are involved. I always say that the time when many people see the rabbis are hatch, match, and dispatch. Have you heard that? Hatch when the baby is born, match at weddings, and dispatch at the time of death, right? Hatch, match, and dispatch. So this is one of those times. So do it right. My attitude is, even if you don't understand all the details, there's a reason for all those details. And I want to be buried the way that Maimonides and Rabbi Akiva and my grandfather. I want like direct connection in the right way. Again, if there's no choice, like the Kovno Ghetto story with the Nazi, no choice, and it's burial in a non-Jewish cemetery versus cremation. Yeah, better to be buried. But for 99.9% of us, in 99.9% of cases, there's no reason to compromise on that. You can have a proper Jewish burial. Just to give you an idea, again, if you remember, I was never into this until about 10 years ago. And then I went to my first Tahara. Tahara means purification. The Chevra Kadisha, the burial society. The burial society, by the way, in the actual translation, it's not called the burial society. It's called the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society. The only organization that I know of in Jewish history that's known as the Holy Society is those who take care of the dead, and it's beautiful. I want to tell you honestly, I attended my first Tahara with Rabbi Yochanan Zon in New York, 8, 9 years ago, whenever it was. And it was men do it for men, women do it for women. And it's incredibly respectful. Body parts are covered. People are saying Tehillim. They ask forgiveness from the deceased if they moved the body part by mistake or they dropped or whatever. It was one of the most beautiful, holy experiences of my life. And I'm saying that I'm like a rationalist. I'm not like a mystical, like high in the air type of a guy. Adam knows me and the Lintons know me. Like, I'm not one of those. I respect them, but just not like. But this was it was incredibly beautiful and spiritual. And it's a baby is born, baby is washed, a baby is wrapped, and begins its new life. The person dies. The person is washed, the person is wrapped up, and the person goes into the next stage of the afterlife. Right? It's an incredible thing. So do it right. So that's why I say that you always have the very, very clear in your living will or whatever it is, that this is the Chabad rabbi, this is the number, all final decisions made by them, anything like that, and end of life issues, burial issues. Just do it right. And it's people are always happy when they make that decision for their relatives. And I meet people all the time that regret not making that decision for their relatives if they didn't. So Leslie, you asked if cremation affects resurrection. Interesting. I'm glad you asked it. The rabbis are probably wondering, so we invite this guy from Israel to speak about burial and cremation. And he speaks for like, I don't know, it's almost an hour or something like that now. And he didn't mention the number one reason that our tradition talks about. The number one reason that tradition talks about for burial is in fact your question about resurrection, the resurrection of the dead. Now, I want to be honest with you, okay? I grew up traditional, but I didn't grow up that, that knowledgeable. And as over the years, as I've learned more, I've started to really, connect with it and I do more. I find that's true for most people, by the way. The more you know, the more you do. It's an interesting kind of a thing. So when I was sort of getting into it, and I was, looking into all these things, I found that like there were certain issues that like really surprised me, and resurrection was one of them. Because when I think intuitively of the dead coming back to life, I'm not proud of this, but you know what I think of intuitively? Thriller. Remember Michael Jackson, the first great music video of the modern world was like 7 minutes long. All the bodies come out of the graveyard, right? Zombies, every time I'm on a plane, I used to be on a plane a lot, like, there's zombie movies and zombies, like the dead coming back to life, resurrection sounds like just ridiculous, right? We believe in this stuff. So the truth is that there's many core, beautiful Jewish ideas that because of Hollywood or other religions or whatever way we've gotten to know them, they seem ridiculous, right? So, and they're not ridiculous. They're actually beautiful and true. So the idea is like this. Remember we talked about the body being good in our view, right? God is a good God that created a good body, a good physical world. We don't deny it. We don't fight. We know it's not bad. We appreciate it. It's our partner, right? The body and the soul are partners. So, think of that logic like the next steps. Not only is the body good, the body has a role to play in the future. For those of you who have been to Israel, you probably went to Masada, the famous desert fortress on the Dead Sea. At Masada in the 1950s, Yigal Yadin, who was the chief archaeologist at the time, found 2,000-year-old date pits, right? Those date pits were then used, they extracted the DNA, and there's now palm trees growing in the En-Gedi Botanical Gardens a little bit up the road. Right? Remember Dolly, that sheep that was cloned? That was 40 years ago. They can now do much more. There's celebrities in Hollywood that have cloned their dogs. Google it. The idea of the dead coming back to life is not science fiction. It's science today. Right? It's not crazy. The Talmud says that there's a certain bone, they call it a luz bone, right? Many people think it's back here, that never gets destroyed. Now, what that could mean, and this is just me speaking, I'm not speaking for religion, but what that could mean is simply that infinitesimally small DNA lasts, and from DNA you can take anything. Jurassic Park is an exaggeration, but only an exaggeration. We can do it with animals, right? So the point is like this. Yes, we actually do believe that the physical world is good. Our physical bodies are good, and they have a role to play in the future, and they are going to come back in some form. What that means exactly, I have no idea. You and I will get together and discuss it in our new bodies, okay? We'll share that, who knows? But I will tell you that our tradition says if you actively do something to deny it, right? If you choose to fight that, you can't enjoy the fruits of it. Meaning a victim of the Holocaust, or I believe very clearly, somebody who has no idea about burial and cremation, they grew up on a Pacific Island, even know they were Jewish, whatever, right? So they're not actively choosing against cremation, right? It was done against their will or just out of complete. But if a person openly says that, listen, I don't want this, I'm going to burn the body, then you can't expect to benefit from it, right? So that's where our tradition does say that cremation does have an effect on resurrection in that way. A few more questions I see that, is the halach to be buried in a Jewish cemetery? Absolutely. By the way, this is a norm for most religions. Lahavdil, Islam, it's Muslims and a Muslim cemetery only, and with Catholics. I mean, there's a reason for this. The idea is that you're part of a living community. Our understanding, I don't know what they believe, but our understanding is that we are part of a living community, and we are defining ourselves as part of a historic community forever as well. By the way, this gets complicated when you have Jews and non-Jews, modern intermarriage reality, let's be honest. There are solutions to that problem, so talk to the rabbis. There are certain places that they have a partition up in the cemetery. Certain places they have, side by side with a different. You can talk to the rabbis and they'll help you figure it out. The important thing is that yes, we believe that we don't live Judaism alone. What do I mean by that? Open up a Jewish prayer book next time you go to the synagogue or at home, right? And try and count how many prayers you can find in the singular and how many prayers you find in the plural, right? I believe you'll find 2 in the singular. The first thing we say when a Jew wakes up in the morning, Modeh Ani, I am thankful to God, and Elokai Neshama, right? The 2 prayers at the beginning. Almost every other prayer, you'll correct me if I'm missing 1 or 2 rabbis, but almost every other prayer, the hundreds of prayer, everything through our tradition, they're all plural. Send us health, us, because we are a community. That's what's been so hard in COVID, by the way. It's much, much harder. Judaism is not meant to be lived alone, and we're not meant to die alone. And that's why we do focus very much on being buried in a Jewish cemetery with the community. Rabbi Edelman, you asked, what would I say to somebody whose parents chose cremation, or a person who chose it for their relatives? I would say like this. Despite the stereotypes, ladies and gents, we're not into Jewish guilt. I know everybody's surprised by that, but guilt is not a Jewish thing. People, l'chaim, to life, if something happened in the past, they did, or you did what you thought was best at the time. We're not perfect. We don't always make perfect decisions. Don't beat yourself up. What you do is you make a donation to the local Chabad in their memory. They didn't ask me to say that, but they deserve it. And you move on. And it's all about future decisions. You make sure that you make the right decision for yourself and for your loved ones. And you get a copy of my book, Cremation or Burial. You put it on your coffee table so your relatives will see it and ask about it. Whatever you're going to do, God will take care of things. We have to make the best decisions we can. Don't beat yourself up. Just move on and try and improve your own life and the lives of those around you.
I want to interject a moment, if you don't mind. Deb
Please.
Hackers over here from Aquanago. I would like to ask her to share a few words, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm very honored. Thank you, Doron. It was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
My mother died of cancer unexpectedly in 2008, and she had always told me she wanted to be cremated, and I'd argue about it with her, but never really understood except it was probably due to cost because she had lived on a limited income. She died, and we planned, as per her wishes, a cremation. And I was very, very unhappy about this. And when I told my son, he called Rabbi Taub, who was in Milwaukee, and he was his rabbi at the time. He has since left the community. He called me, Rabbi Taub did, and said, "I know why you're calling me." I said, "I know why you're calling me." And that was because I knew he wanted to convince me to bury my mother. And I wanted to bury my mother, but I didn't want to go against her wishes. But I shared with him almost what you said. My mother said to me, "I was born a Jew, and I'm going to die as a Jew." She was very non-observant. She wasn't really interested. She put up the Easter bunny anyway. He said to me, "Well, she's giving you permission by saying that to bury her." So very quickly, to cut to the chase, one call, another rabbi was called, and my family had all been buried at Agudas Achim, which is now run by the Chabad. And within a few hours, even the funeral home, we had switched her to the wooden casket, to the Chevra Kadisha was arranged. And within 24 hours, she was buried. And I've never regretted the decision. My brother did not give me a difficult time. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And I want to thank you for your presentation, because it reinforces that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Beautifully articulated. So thank you. I used to say that I've never met anybody who regretted choosing burial. And people used to say, well, that's probably because they're dead. So I meant like for other people. That's just the reality. I put on the chat a few resources for you. And obviously the best resource online for anything Jewish is Chabad.org. If you're not there regularly, you should be. It's a wealth of knowledge and information. By the way, on this subject, there's actually quite a bit. You can just go into the search button and find. They have a couple articles and a video from yours truly, but also a lot of other, well thought out articles and audio and video from other people as well. If you are in a position that you can, and most of us can, you actually read a book. Forgive me for plugging my own Cremation and Burial, a Jewish View. It's got what we talked about with all the stats and a lot of other stories and inspiration and things like that. You can get that at the website of the publisher, mosaicapress.com, or Amazon, if you want. There's a website that I created with a colleague of mine called Peaceful Return. I think .org or .com or both actually, that is just focused on this, and it has top 10 lists, and it has short videos, and it has audios. So if you're in a rush, and you need quick information for somebody who's challenged by this last minute, that's a good resource, for you as well.
Hey.
I think rabbis, maybe, I know it's getting late. I don't want to keep people. I have put on the chat my, my personal email. I'm really bad at phone and that kind of stuff, but I do generally, answer emails. So again, the best resource for you obviously is your rabbi. Locally, talk to them. That's what they're there for, what they're great at. But if there's something specific on this issue, I'm glad to, try and help. So you can, you can certainly, you can certainly be in touch.
Doron, thank you very, very much for presenting. This was so important. It's a very important topic. I'm sure many people enjoyed. I want to thank Rabbi Edelman and the Bayside community for joining. And again, you have his website. You can reach out to Doron. I already received, Doron, in the middle of your presentation, a private chat. Somebody told me they want to sponsor a few books for our library, so we're already in business. Hopefully one Jew at a time to educate, and we want to thank you very much for this presentation.
Wonderful. I only have one question, everybody. Now that we're done for the moment, and I look forward to coming to Wisconsin eventually, meeting you, and I have a couple of old friends now, so it's nice to see you. But my question is, it's now 4:15 a.m. in the Holy Land, and I am fully caffeinated, and the adrenaline is going. What am I supposed to do now? It's lockdown here. I can't even go for a run. What am I supposed to do? Stay up. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate that.
All emails that you're about to get.
There you go. I'll learn some Tanya rabbis. How about that?
Oh, now we're talking.
There we go. In the middle of the night. There you go.
Go ahead.
Okay, good night, everybody. It's been a real pleasure. All the best.
What do you
Um,
do if someone asks you to go for the spreading of the ashes, a family member, and you don't want to go?
Yeah, so I would say like this, okay? I'm glad you asked that. It'll be I guess our last, focus
was in
just for
the
the
chat.
evening. It's fair, it's
Yeah.
fair enough. The people say, what do you do with the ashes? Okay, so I'm gonna give you the halachic Jewish law answer, and then I'm gonna give you the psychological, sensitivity answer, okay? The halachic answer is that ashes are irrelevant. A Kohen who's not allowed to go into a cemetery can carry or touch ashes. They have no DNA, physically, there's no DNA there. I've talked to forensics experts, right? It doesn't exist, it's burnt out. They have no halakhic Jewish law significance. Throw them in the garbage, who cares? Then that's not the person, it's just dirt. That's the strict halakhic answer. But the psychological sensitive answer is that this is meaningful to somebody. It's not, you're not talking about the future. You're not talking about, so you have to judge the situation very carefully. And if there's a way that you cannot participate because you're not comfortable with it without offending, that's one thing. But there's no necessarily halakhic problem of showing respect for the memory of the dead, just like it can be like a memorial service or something like that, as if the ashes weren't there. You get the dichotomy over here. On the one hand, it's not actually the person, and the ashes are irrelevant, and the whole thing. On the other hand, like, listen, this means something to them. So it's not so simple to just stay away from something that really doesn't mean anything anyway. Right. That's but I would talk to the rabbis about that. Again, maybe it's a good way for us to finish, tonight. A comedian once said, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying." Right. So we all have this sort of like sense that we want to do the right thing, especially at the end of life. It's not easy. It's not, there's uncomfortable situations, and it's not perfect. But what we can do is try and make the best decisions that we can make, and make sure that when my time comes and when my kids and all that, that there's no fighting, there's no issues. It's all taken care of. I've paid for it already. I've made the plans already. The funeral home knows what they're going to do. It's going to be in the Jewish cemetery according to Jewish law. And then everything goes smoothly. And you have these conversations, Rabbi, as you're pointing out, you have these conversations correctly with people and early on, so that it becomes a time of togetherness and a time of growing and a time of bonding rather than a time of division. And really, that's especially in our age, what we need is more togetherness and less division. Thanks, everybody. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish you all the best.